So the position on free will for which I argue is the most controversial one, the view that we don't have free will. So in the history of the discipline, the worry about free will stems mainly from the threat of determinism. And there are two historical reasons to believe that determinism is true. One is naturalistic. The idea is that when you think about nature and the laws governing nature, the most natural idea is that the laws are deterministic. So that take any time slice of the universe and add to that the deterministic laws. Every subsequent stage of the universe is thereby rendered inevitable. Okay? So this would entail that as a result of some past time slice of the universe and the natural laws, all of our actions are inevitable. The worry then is that if that's true, are we free in the sense required for moral responsibility? And many people in the history of philosophy have worried about this. The other threat to free will comes from the theological concern. Right? According to a fairly widespread theological tradition, especially within the monotheistic theological tradition, God causally determines everything that happens. And if God from all eternity causally determines everything that happens, then a lot of people think that this is a threat to our having the sort of free will required for moral responsibility. Hey, now, there are a number of responses to this dilemma. One is to say, well, despite appearances, determinism is false, and this allows us to have free will. This is the libertarian view. Another response, which is, I think, the favored response among philosophers, is to say that determinism and free will, the kind of free will we're talking about, are really compatible. Right? I think that's the majority response in the history of philosophy and the majority position among contemporary philosophers. The third view, the one for which I argue, is the position argued for by Spinoza in the 17th century. Spinoza says that because determinism is true, we're not free in the sense required for moral responsibility. So he's a hard determinist. He believes that determinism is true, and because determinism is true, we're not free in the sense at issue. Now, ever since David Hume wrote about this topic in the 18th century, another threat to moral responsibility has appeared on the horizon. And that's not determinism, but rather indeterminism. Right? So the question is indeterminism, suppose determinism is false, is this also a threat to moral responsibility? Actually, this was a topic of discussion way back in the time that the Stoics and Epicureans were duking it out. Right? Because the Stoics were determinists. They're both theological determinists and naturalistic determinists. And their opponents, the Epicureans, said determinism is false. Right? They're also atomists. They accepted the atomism of Democritus. And they said, look, here's how it goes. The atoms, the universe consists just in atoms, and our minds consist just in atoms as well. Now, you'd think that the atoms are governed by deterministic laws, and this is in fact what Democritus thought. But this is actually false, because every once in a while, in the downward path of an atom, there's a random swerve. Right? And this random swerve accounts for our being free. Right? So our free actions, our free choices, are just random swerves in the downward paths of atoms. Now, the Stoics said about this, look, indeterminism is as much of a threat to free will as determinism is. For after all, we're not in control of the random swerve of an atom, right? It just kind of happens. Right? So we're not in control of that. So how could we be free as a result of some random swerve of an atom in our minds? Right? So we have this double threat, right? And that's the way the debate has evolved in the contemporary era. We have this double threat to free will. A threat from determinism. If determinism is true, it seems that we can't be free. And if indeterminism is true, it seems that we can't be in control of our actions and hence can't be free either. So, some people have said free will is impossible. This guy Galen Strawson, for example, believes that free will is impossible. There's this double threat from determinism and indeterminism. So I wouldn't call myself a hard determinist, because I do believe that there's this double threat, although I do think that there's a way of avoiding it. But the way of avoiding it, I think, comes at too great a cost to be believed. So in the end, I want to say, yeah, with Spinoza, that we don't have the sort of free will required for moral responsibility. So let me elaborate on that view. So if you look at your handouts, the first Here's a kind of general definition of my view. I call it free will skepticism or hard incompatibilism. It says the sort of free will required for moral responsibility is incompatible with determinism and with certain varieties of indeterminism, and we lack this sort of free will. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the notion of moral responsibility at issue in the free will debate is a very special one. The term moral responsibility has lots of meanings in the English language, and there are certain kinds of moral responsibility that are not at issue in the free will debate. The one that is at issue is one that involves what I call fundamental desert or basic desert, and I define it under point 2. So for an agent to be morally responsible for an action, in the main sense at issue in the free will debate, is for it to belong to her in such a way that she deserved blame if she understood that it was morally wrong, and she deserved credit or perhaps praise if she understood that it was morally exemplary. Supposing what? Supposing this desert is basic in the sense that the agent would deserve the blame or credit just because she's performed the action. And you see this issue at play in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant when he is discussing the issue of the justification of criminal punishment. He says, when you're trying to justify criminal punishment, you can't look to the good of society. And you can't even look to the good of the criminal. You got to say that the criminal should be punished just because he deserves it. That's the fundamental reason for punishment. And that's the idea of desert. That's, I think, at play in the free will debate. So the question is, do we have the sort of control over action? Do we have the sort of control over action that allows us to be morally responsible in this fundamental desert sense? This sense of responsibility was reintroduced into the debate, in my view anyway, in the early 60s through this famous essay by P.F. Strawson, one of the greatest British philosophers of the mid-century. And he said, look, what's really at issue in the free will debate is the reactive attitudes like moral indignation, moral resentment, guilt, gratitude. And what these attitudes build in is this sense of basic desert. When we're angry with someone, in the sense of indignation, what we presuppose is that the person deserves blame or perhaps punishment just because of what he's done. And when we're grateful to a person, in the reactive attitude sense that Strawson's interested in, we presuppose that the person deserves praise just because of what she's done. So, question is that sort of moral responsibility and the control required for it, which we call free will, is that compatible with determinism and indeterminism? Now, compatibilists say it's compatible with determinism, and I've got an argument against it. It's a manipulation argument. What I want to say is that the idea that we can be morally responsible for actions, in the sense that I just specified, if determinism is true, is an illusion. This is something we can think because, after all, if we're told that determinism is true, we still have the reactive attitudes that we ordinarily have. That if somebody does something really nasty to us, this is something that Hume says. He says, even if you believe that determinism is true, if somebody does something really nasty to you, you're still going to blame him, and you're still going to have the reactive attitudes that you ordinarily have. Determinism is going to make no difference. Now, I want to say that determinism does make a difference, and you can see this if you compare determinism to being manipulated by some outside source, like by some other agent or a neuroscientist. So here's how I want to set up this argument against compatibilism. What compatibilists have said is that you don't need the absence of determinism for moral responsibility. All that's really required is for certain conditions of action and agency to be satisfied, conditions that don't presuppose the falsity of determinism. So Hume, for example, says that what's got to be the case for you to be morally responsible is for you not to be coerced by some outside source, for example. Other Humeans have said it's got to be the case that you're not caused by some disease like kleptomania or some sort of mental illness to behave as you do. Other people in the rationalist tradition have said that what's required for moral responsibility is that you're responsive to the reasons in your situation. John Fisher, for example, is a compatibilist, and he thinks that this is the key condition for moral responsibility. Now, it's my sense that these conditions aren't going to do what they need to do for compatibilism to be plausible. And you can see this if you imagine a situation in which an agent is manipulated by some neuroscientist into performing an action so that the action is performed in a situation in which all the compatibilist conditions are satisfied. Okay? So you can imagine a neuroscientist manipulating an agent to, let's say, kill somebody, right? And making sure that all the compatibilist conditions that compatibilists have come up with are in fact satisfied. So that the agent, say, is not coerced by having a gun held to his head, the agent doesn't have kleptomania, the agent has no mental illness, the agent is responsive to reasons. Okay? And I want to say that it's intuitive that in a case like that, the agent's not morally responsible. So the compatibilist conditions turn out not to be sufficient for moral responsibility. Okay? Now, arguments like that have been proposed in the past, but I want to soup it up a little bit by adding a few cases. So if you look on under number 3 here, in my argument against compatibilism, I've got an outline of what I call a multiple case manipulation argument against compatibilism. So in this setup, I not only have a single manipulation case in which the compatibilist conditions are satisfied, in which it's supposed to be intuitive that the agent is not morally responsible. Rather, I've got 4 cases, and the 4th case is the ordinary one, at least an ordinary deterministic one, in which naturalistic determinism is true. All the compatibilist conditions for moral responsibility hold, but the agent is causally determined to perform some bad act, such as a murder. Okay? In the first case, I imagine that the manipulation is really extreme, so that the manipulator, just before the agent begins to reason about his situation, pushes a button to kind of enhance the egoistic quality of the reasoning so that the agent will be causally determined to act as he does. Okay? And in the second case, I set it up so that the manipulation occurs at the beginning of the agent's life. So you can imagine some super scientist, or maybe God, setting up an agent so that, kind of like a wind-up toy, like Leibniz's monad, for example, right? So that the agent can foresee that in the crucial situation in which the agent has the opportunity to kill this other person, the agent will in fact do so as a result of egoistic reasoning. And in the third case, I set things up so that the agent is rigorously trained in a somewhat strange community to be rationally egoistic in these kinds of cases, with the result that in the situation in which he now finds himself, he's causally determined to perform the murder for egoistic reasons. So not only do we have a bunch of cases in which the compatibilist conditions are satisfied and the agent is intuitively not morally responsible, now we've set things up so that it's going to be very hard to see how an agent can be morally responsible in this last case, the ordinary case, while it's so evident that the agent is not morally responsible in the first case, okay, the first case in which there's local manipulation. Look, if the neuroscientist pushes a button, enhances the egoistic quality of the reasoning so that the agent's causally determined to kill his victim, I think it's going to be very evident the agent's not morally responsible. But now I ask you, what's the difference between case 1 and case 2 that will legitimate a judgment of responsibility in case 2, not in case 1? You know, is it the fact that all the manipulation takes place at the beginning of his life in case 2 and it's local in case 1? That couldn't make the difference between responsibility and non-responsibility. What about the difference between case 2 and case 3? That the manipulation take place as a result of the rigorous training of a community as opposed to some agent that sets the murderer up at the beginning of his life? That couldn't make the difference between responsibility and non-responsibility. And I don't see that there is a difference between the third case and the fourth case, the rigorous training case and the ordinary causal determination case, that could make the difference between responsibility and non-responsibility either. Right? So I'd say the conclusion is it's pretty evident that if an agent's causally determined, that the agent's not morally responsible for his action. And in fact, what explains the non-responsibility is just causal determination. It's not the non-satisfaction of the compatibilist conditions that can explain this, because in each of the cases, the compatibilist conditions are in fact satisfied. Okay, so more generally, it's that even if you're disposed to think that causal determination is compatible with moral responsibility, I think reflection on the similarities between manipulation cases and a causally determined situation, reflection on those similarities should get you to think that compatibilism is false, that a causally determined agent isn't morally responsible in the sense at issue. Okay, so that's compatibilism. What about libertarianism, the other really popular view? So libertarians think that determinism is false, and because determinism is false, we can have the sort of freedom required for moral responsibility. I'd say it's the dominant position among religious people in this country, maybe not among philosophers. And in the history of philosophy, it had a lot of prominent advocates, perhaps most notably Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant didn't think that he could show that we have libertarian freedom, but he did think that we should believe that we have it, for the sake of morality. So in the trade, there are two main sorts of libertarianisms. One says, look, all causation is by way of events. Events are what? Like substances or things having properties at times. Like the car's speeding through the puddle, right, at a certain time. That made me wet. That's an instance of event causation. And a lot of people think that all causation is by way of events. So in the case of agents, what would cause an action is an event like, Anne's desiring to be at work at time. Anne's desiring to be at work on time at a certain time. Or Anne's desiring to help someone in trouble at a certain time. Those are the kinds of events that cause actions on the event causal view. So event causal libertarianism says that, actually write this on the board for you. So Robert Kane has this nice case. He's the main event causal libertarian these days, philosopher at University of Texas. And he says, look, freedom consists in the fact that when decisions are caused, they're caused indeterministically by other events. There's this idea of indeterministic causation. Not all causation is indeterministic, but yet all causation is by way of events. So events indeterministically cause decisions, and this is what allows them to be free. He's got a nice case that he sets up. We imagine Anne, and she's trying to be at work in time to please her boss. She's got to make an important meeting, but she sees a mugging in an alley, and the victim needs help. So now she's got this choice. The prudential choice is to speed on to work and please the boss. The moral choice is to stop and help the victim of the assault. Now, on the event causal picture, it's just events that cause actions. So we have the following situation. We can simplify it. We can say Anne's desiring to please her boss at T. There's one cause, right? And Anne's desiring to help the victim at T. There's the other cause. We'll get a lot more events that are going to be involved here, but let's simplify it and have just these two events doing the causing. And let's suppose with Kane that the strength of each of these causes is about the same. So this renders 50% probable the decision to speed on, and this renders 50% probable the decision to stop and help. Okay. So Here's the central worry for event-causal libertarianism, in my view. We have these events, okay, of which this one's representative, that renders the decision to speed on 50% probable. Got these other events that render the decision to stop 50% probable. Okay? Now it's going to resolve in one way or another. Suppose that she does in fact decide to stop. Now at this point we want to ask, well, what settles, right? What settles whether this agent N stops or not? It's not these agent involving events that settles whether she stops or not. After all, the agent involving events render the two decisions equally probable. So the answer, I think, has to be nothing. There isn't anything that settles which way the decision goes, because the only causation involving the agent consists in events involving the agent, and by hypothesis, all the events involving the agent conspire to render each of the two possible decisions equally probable. Okay? So I want to say that in the event-causal picture, nothing settles which decision occurs, and in particular, the agent doesn't settle which of the decisions occurs. Okay? So I don't think that the agent can have enough control for freedom on the event-causal picture. I don't think there's any event-causal picture that solves this problem. Okay? So what should the libertarian say at this point? The problem with this event-causal libertarian view is that the agent disappears at the crucial time. Right? We want the agent to settle which way the decision goes, but the event-causal picture doesn't allow this. So what we should do is to reintroduce the agent in a different guise. Right? And as agent, or as agent cause. So we're going to say, look, not all causation is by way of events. Some causation is by way of agents. So N, as a substance, not just as involved in events, causes the decision. So we're going to give N as agent cause the power to settle which way this decision goes. Okay? And we're going to give her this power in the following guise. We're going to say she's got the power to settle which way the agent, which way the decision goes. By what? By causing a decision, and by causing a decision without being causally determined to cause it. This is what Immanuel Kant calls transcendental freedom. And he thinks that this is the only kind of freedom that's going to get us moral responsibility. Okay? So it's giving to the agent, qua agent, not as involved in events, but giving the agent, qua agent, the power to cause an action without being causally determined to cause it. Now, this is a very special sort of power. Do we have this kind of power? Kant said, well, we have no evidence that we have this kind of power. We can't even show that it's possible that we have this kind of power. But we can show that it doesn't contradict anything we believe. Right? So we should believe it for moral reasons. He thought it's really important for us to believe that we're morally responsible. And he also thought that the moral law kind of falls away unless we're free in this sense. So we thought that we have, Kant thinks that we have ample practical reason to believe that we're agent causes. But there are certain kinds of empirical worries that Kant was well aware of for the hypothesis that we're agent causes. I used to be an agent causalist before I became a Spinozist, so I kind of like this view. I've always argued that it's coherent. But I think there's an empirical problem for it, again, that Kant was well aware of. The problem is this, that Kant says, look, the physical world is governed by deterministic laws. So suppose we believe that we as agents have this power of transcendental freedom, the power to cause an action without being causally determined to cause it. At some point, there's going to be an interaction between the agent as cause and the deterministic world. Maybe at the juncture between the agent and the agent's brain. Maybe you can think of agents, agent causes, as non-physical things that can affect the physical world. Suppose we think of it that way. Kant says the physical world is governed by deterministic laws. Okay? So you got the physical world down here, which includes the agent's body. Okay, here's the agent's body. And here you have the transcendentally free agent. Okay? So suppose this free agent, right? Suppose this free agent causes the decision to raise her hand without being causally determined to cause it. Right? Kant says it has to be reconciled with the following fact that we know from Newtonian physics. The physical world is governed by deterministic laws. So how can this be? Right? How can this be? It would seem that if the free agent freely, in Kant's sense, causes the decision to raise her hand, that the hand raising isn't going to be causally determined. But Kant said that physics shows that the laws are deterministic, okay? And that all physical events are governed by deterministic laws. Okay, so one thing you can say is, well, it just so happens that every free decision ever made just happens to dovetail nicely with a determined physical world. Okay? So each of the, how many free decisions have been made in human history according to Kant? Say 17 trillion. Okay? Each of those 17 trillion decisions happens to dovetail with the way that physical bodies have been causally determined since the beginning of the universe. And I say that involves coincidences too wild to be believed. Okay? That's not really credible. So Kant at a certain point says, well, this problem can be solved because when a free agent makes a decision, that free agent changes the universe back to the beginning of time. And he says this in the Critique of Practical Reason. I say, well, that's a pretty high price to pay for a belief in transcendental freedom. Seems implausible. Okay, contemporary agent causalists have said, well, maybe quantum physics will come to the rescue. Maybe the laws governing the physical world are indeterministic. Are indeterministic. And I want to say that this doesn't help for the following reason. Suppose that the laws are indeterministic. So let's take a class of action. See, according to quantum physics, if the indeterministic interpretation is true, right, actions would be governed by statistical laws as opposed to deterministic laws. Right? So let's take that class of actions, right, that class of possible actions, each of whose physical consequences have some particular percentage chance of occurring, say 32%. Okay? Now, what does the physical law say? It says we should expect, right, that within that class, those physical actions will be actual about 32% of the time. Now, in order for this Kantian reconciliation project between transcendental freedom and the physical world to work out, it would have to be the case that for this class of actions, the agent's choices would have to be exactly in sync, or almost exactly in sync with the probabilistic laws. So that for this class of actions, the free choices of agents would have to be for the action at issue right about 32% of the time. And I say this is too wild a coincidence to be believed. Okay? So I don't think that this indeterministic solution works either. Okay? Now at this point, the agent causalist can say, with Roderick Chisholm, okay, famous philosopher of Brown, who was an agent causalist, he says, well, the reconciliation project doesn't work. What you have to believe if you're an agent causalist is that every time a human being acts freely, a miracle occurs in the physical world. And that's the miracle view. Okay? Now, maybe that's true. I can't rule that out. But it's a pretty high price to pay for a belief in freedom. Okay? It's not clear that it's credible that every time a free action occurs, the physical laws are violated. Okay, so that's the libertarian view. What we're left with then is the view that we don't have the sort of free will required for moral responsibility, and that's the position I defend. Now, the problem for this sort of view isn't so much an empirical problem. It isn't the sort of compatibility problem that we see for compatibilism and for event-causal libertarianism. It's rather this. Is it really believable? Right? Can we really believe that we lack the sort of freedom required for moral responsibility in this basic desert-entailing sense? Right? So that whenever you're indignant with somebody just because of what he's done, you're presupposing a falsehood. Right? You're making some sort of mistake. You're presupposing that the person is blameworthy in the basic desert sense, whereas the person isn't really blameworthy in that sense. And every time you are grateful to somebody for doing something that you consider to be praiseworthy, you're also making a mistake. Can we believe that? Can we believe that? Would our lives work out the way we want them to work out if we held that sort of view? Another problem is for controlling bad behavior. Criminal punishment, for example. Don't we presuppose in punishing criminals that they deserve punishment just because of what they've done? Immanuel Kant says, you can believe in the deterrence theory of punishment, that the point of punishment is to deter others, or you can believe in the moral education theory of punishment, that the point of punishment is to morally educate criminals. But punishment is going to be illegitimate unless it's the case that criminals deserve to be punished just because of what they've done. And that seems to go out the window if you cease to believe in free will. Okay, so let me take criminal punishment first. We lose the retributive justification of punishment, the Kantian justification that I just outlined, if we believe what Spinoza did about the sort of free will required for more responsibility. But what we do, a criminology that turns out to be legitimate on the Spinozan view, makes use of the quarantine analogy. So we think it's okay to quarantine carriers of dangerous diseases, even if they're not morally responsible for being the carriers of the dangerous diseases that they are. Right? Why is this? Because of the danger these carriers of diseases pose to society. And I would say that if quarantining is okay in the case of the dangerous disease, it's also okay in the case of a really dangerous criminal. So one difference is that in the quarantine case, we don't think it's okay to inflict pain on the person being quarantined beyond what's required just to quarantine him, to keep society safe. And I think you'd have to accept that for criminology as well. If the only reason for confining criminals was a reason analogous to what we have in the case of the justification of quarantining carriers of dangerous diseases. Okay, so what about the reactive attitudes that Strawson talks about? What about our personal relationships? Our personal relationships, Strawson says, essentially involve the reactive attitudes, and they wouldn't work if we got rid of them. So indignation is required. He says moral resentment is required. If somebody does something wrong, it's really important to be indignant. Why? Well, partly because this has a communicative function in the relationship. How do you communicate hurt or pain or wrongdoing other than by the reactive attitudes? And even if there are other ways, isn't this by far the most effective way of communicating these problems? And isn't it very important for us to communicate joy through expressing gratitude? Or love. Strawson actually thinks that love is one of the reactive attitudes, and that without love, of course, personal relationships would be impossible. So on Strawson's suggestion, if we cease to believe in free will, we'd cease to believe in the appropriateness even of love. And certainly that would undermine the kinds of relationships that make our lives meaningful. So what do we say about all of this? Well, first, indignation. When we're indignant, we're angry with somebody just because of what he's done. Now, in my view, there's certainly going to be wrongdoing in a world without free will. Right? It's not as if moral right and wrong require indeterminism or the sort of freedom required for moral responsibility. After all, even if the serial killer is causally determined to behave as he does by some mental illness, we still think that what he did was wrong. So wrongdoing survives, I think, in the Spinozan world, the world without free will. Now, there are ways of communicating wrongdoing other than through indignation and resentment. Well, there are even emotions, I think, that communicate wrongdoing. Sometimes when a child has done something really bad, the parent isn't angry anymore. The parent is just very sorrowful or sad. Right? So we have this other emotion, moral sorrow or moral sadness, that I think can communicate what anger and indignation and resentment often do. So this is a non-reactive attitude. an emotion for communicating wrongdoing that would be accessible in the Spinozan world, the world without free will. Okay. What about gratitude? Okay. What about gratitude? Well, I want to say that maybe there's some kinds of gratitude that presuppose praiseworthiness in the basic desert sense, but I think a lot of gratitude reactions don't presuppose that. When we're grateful to a child for a small favor, for example, we presuppose that the child has done something great and we're very happy about this. I don't think that we presuppose that the child deserves praise just because of what she's done. So I do think that there's kind of at least a part of gratitude, or maybe an analog of gratitude, that survives the criticisms of free will that I just presented. Okay. So what about love? Strawson thinks, as I pointed out, that this is a reactive attitude as well. Does love require the sort of free will required for more responsibility? Well, in my view, in typical cases, this isn't so. Take romantic love, for example. When you fall romantically in love, I think that the will isn't even involved in the typical case. When you fall for somebody, it's not as if you will to fall for that person. It just happens, right, in the typical case. Now, one thing you might say is that in these kinds of cases, you love the person that you love because of, say, her freely willed actions. But I doubt if this is typically the case. Often it's because of personality characteristics other than those that involve free will. Right? Often it's looks. Right? Often it's other factors that don't involve free will. Right? But I think it's seldom the case that free will is the target of love in the typical romantic case. Or take the case of children. Parents love their children. Baby's born, you love the kid. Is the will involved? Not at all. Is the kid's will involved? Not at all. Right? The will plays no role whatsoever in the love of children, I say, when the children are very young. Now, maybe when they're older, the will's involved. Suppose the kid does something really nasty or is a difficult child, and the parent may want to will to love the kid, despite the fact that it no longer comes naturally. Okay, there the will is involved. Okay, I can agree with that. But it doesn't seem as if that sort of voluntariness has to be the free will required for moral responsibility. That sort of voluntariness, the sort of voluntariness that's involved in making a relationship work in a difficult situation, need be the kind of free will that eventuates in deserved praise or deserved blame. So it seems to me that love doesn't require free will. It may sometimes involve the will, require the will. It doesn't require the sort of free will required for more responsibility. Now, one thing that some people like Kane have said is this. Look, you think that these manipulation cases show that free will is incompatible with determinism. But I can use a manipulation case to show you that determinism is incompatible with the kind of love that we really want. Okay? So suppose you find out that, let's say somebody loves you and you really care about this relationship, but that this person was causally determined by neuroscientists to love you. Okay? What about that? You might not like that. Right? But I wonder if this is really true. Don't we usually think that people are causally determined by factors beyond their control to love us? Right? Isn't that why we have this image of Cupid shooting the arrow? Right? But even in determination or manipulation cases, I think some are such that we'd really be bothered by them. They suppose that the following is the case, that somebody's really in love with you, but you're not in love with this person. And what this person does is slips love potion number 9 into your martini, which causes you to be unaware or cease to be aware of all this person's faults. And as a result, you fall in love with this person. You might say, well, this is bad news. Okay? I wouldn't want to be manipulated that way into falling in love with somebody. But suppose the manipulation worked differently. Suppose that the person slips a drug into your drink, which, now suppose you got the following problem. You can't make commitments. Okay? It's very difficult for you to make a commitment to another person. And so you disregard other people's good qualities. Okay? So suppose somebody slips a drug into your drink which cures you of this fear of commitment. and allows you to see the other person's good qualities, makes you appreciate the other person's good qualities. As a result, you fall in love with this other person. Okay? Suppose this is all deterministic. How bad would that be? I'd say we wouldn't mind that so much. Okay? So I guess I want to say that in the end, it doesn't seem to me that love, even the kind of love that we really care about most, is incompatible with determination, even with certain kinds of manipulation. So in the last analysis, the main problem for the Spinozan view about free will isn't empirical issues, and it isn't internal issues like what we saw surfaced as problems for both compatibilism and event causal libertarianism. Rather, it's how do we live as if this view is true? Now, Saul Smolanski, philosopher in Israel, has said, look, there are really good arguments that we don't have free will, but there's no way we can live without it. So we should maintain the illusion that we have free will. And we shouldn't teach courses on free will. And not only that, we shouldn't give lectures on free will either. Okay? And he doesn't. He's got a whole book on free will. He never teaches the subject because he doesn't want to cure people of their illusion that we have free will. But the view that I just presented is more optimistic. So I think that we can live, or at least there's a pretty good chance that we can live really great lives even if we don't believe that we have free will. And there are even certain kinds of benefits. For after all, I think one problem that arises as a result of our belief in free will is that we're a little too careless with our retributive attitudes. So free will, the belief that we have free will, justifies us in having the retributive, angry attitudes we have toward other people. Yes, retributive attitudes do have benefits for our lives. They motivate us to resist injustice, right? And to right wrongs and to improve relationships, bad relationships that we're involved in. Right? On the other hand, this sort of retributive anger also causes people to hate each other. Right? It causes people to fight wars, causes people to torture and kill in the worst situations. Right? So one thing Spinoza says is that if we get rid of this belief that we, this is maybe, let me quote this passage of Spinoza's to you. Okay. So about the view that we lack the sort of free will we're talking about, Spinoza says, this doctrine contributes to the social life insofar as it teaches us to hate no one, to disesteem no one, to mock no one, to be angry at no one. Okay? So I want to say that maybe given the concerns to which expression of moral anger gives rise, our coming to believe that we lack this sort of free will may on balance be a good thing. Thank you.